Thank you, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers, the chairs, for the invitation to speak here. This is my first Auditory Cortex conference, and I definitely feel like I've been missing out. So thank you all. So my lab at Purdue works to understand auditory memory and basic auditory perception, specifically for communication signals. We use psychophysics, developmental and cross-cultural and computational approaches with a little bit of neuroimaging. So today, I'm going to be giving you a bit of a flavor of what we do and focusing on a recurrent theme within my work, which is pitch perception. So as has been mentioned several times throughout this meeting, pitch conveys critical information in music, in speech, and many other natural sounds like birdsong. We hear it in tones and computers, and it is one of the most salient parts of many natural scenes. So sounds said to have pitch are generated by repetitive or periodic processes in the world, like the vibration of strings on instruments or the vibration of our vocal cords. And this rate of repetition of periodic sounds is referred to as the fundamental frequency, or F0. And these sounds that are periodic in time generally have harmonics, which are integer multiples of this common fundamental frequency, or F0, and thus generally pitch is defined as our percept corresponding to this periodicity or harmonicity, this F0. So again, the classic definitions of pitch discrimination, so in the classic conception, pitch, it's assumed to rely on representations of F0. So it's thought that you estimate the F0 of one sound, estimate the F0 of, say, the next part of the sound or the next sound, and then compare those two estimates in order to determine that the pitch has changed. However, listeners could use other representations to perform these types of basic tasks. For example, you could just track that all the harmonics shift concurrently. And so several years ago, I sought to re-examine the role of fundamental frequency estimation in pitch perception. And the first experiment I'll be telling you about today involved a basic up-down pitch discrimination task, which I'll refer to as basic discrimination. This is a standard task that's been used in hundreds of studies to measure pitch perception. You play people two notes and ask, is the second note higher or lower than the first? So we did this with several types of notes. So first, just our standard harmonic tones. So hopefully this will play. And it won't, but hopefully you all know what that sounds like. I think let's just roll on. And then we also compared it to inharmonic stimuli. So for these stimuli, I only have two more sounds, so I'll do my best to sing inharmonic stimuli for you. Don't hold me to that. All right, so for these inharmonic stimuli, we jittered frequencies in order to eliminate harmonic relationships between them. So specifically, I would iteratively jitter each successive harmonic by up to 50% of the nominal F0. So this makes these tones inconsistent with any single fundamental frequency. I would play an example, but just to let you know, a lot of instruments are actually naturally inharmonic, so the example sounds a bit like a bell or a gong. So the logic of this approach is that tasks that rely on representations of F0 should be impaired with these inharmonic stimuli. So I'll show you the results of this first experiment on this axis, where the y-axis is percent correct, the x is difference in semitones ranging from 0.1 of a semitone to 1. And so with a standard harmonic tone, I'd play an example where you'd hear the second is higher than the first. Again, please take my word for it, but if you don't take my word for it, I'll show you the data where many participants did say that. So as we increase the pitch difference between the two tones, performance improves. So the question is, what happens when we take these harmonic tones and make them inharmonic? And so according to most traditional models of pitch, inharmonic tones should produce greatly impaired performance. However, what we found when we actually ran this experiment was completely comparable results between these two conditions. So the lines were the curves were almost perfectly overlapping, and this suggests that F0 is evidently not necessary for discriminating up-down movements in pitch. So when I first got this result, I was skeptical. I will say I've now replicated this several times. I will show you many of these replications today. But this result, I think, reveals something pretty interesting, that listeners are using something other than this standard notion of pitch in order to estimate pitch. So how are people completing this task? So something that turned out to be critical about this manipulation is we applied the same vector of random jitter values to each of the two inharmonic tones in these trials. So for example, if the second harmonic was shifted up by 30% of the nominal F0 in the first tone, that same shift was applied to the second harmonic in the second tone. And so we were curious whether listeners could just track this correspondence between harmonics. So to test this, we used a third condition, which we called interharmonic with changing jitters, where every single harmonic in both tones was randomly modified. So there were two alternatives here. If this inharmonic manipulation is just insufficient to disrupt F0, performance should remain possible. But if listeners instead use the correspondence between frequencies, performance should be impaired. And the second option is what we found. Performance was close to chance on this third condition. So this suggests that listeners are able to track consistencies in the spectrum, whether or not the spectrum is harmonic or inharmonic. So again, to remind you, classic definitions of pitch equate pitch to representations of F0, but we found that basic pitch discrimination does not actually require a representation of F0. So it turns out that pitch, this basic feature of music perception, basic feature of speech and auditory perception, is potentially subserved by several different mechanisms. So this result presented a fun puzzle that I've been sort of trying to figure out ever since, and really I've been trying to understand what is the role of F0 and harmonicity sensitivity in perception. I got some clarity on this question by taking this basic task and simply inserting a silent gap between the two notes, just adding a memory load. So my question was, does introducing a delay make discrimination worse for inharmonic compared to harmonic tones? I'll show you the results of this experiment on a slightly different axis here. So we are doing pitch discrimination thresholds. So on the y-axis, we have thresholds in percent. Lower here is better. And I tested people with no delay between tones and then a 3-second delay. So the results were striking. With no delay, we again found no comparable performance for the harmonic and the inharmonic tone thresholds. However, with the delay, thresholds for inharmonic tones were considerably worse. This is a very short delay, just about 1 second, and we've also found worse thresholds with even just a 1-second delay. So the results are suggestive of a memory representation that's somehow specific to harmonic sounds. Now, in these inharmonic stimuli, we've figured out that people must use a representation of the spectrum, of tracking this fine spectral pattern in order to do the task. However, in the harmonic case, listeners could use two representations. They could use a representation of the F0, or they could use a representation of the spectrum. And so far, our experiments are unable to disambiguate those two alternatives. So we added a third condition, which we called an interleaved harmonic condition. In this condition, in the two tones, there's no frequency components in common. So you can no longer track the correspondence between adjacent frequency components. However, they are mathematically related. Therefore, each note does have an F0. When we run this condition, we found a couple of results. So first of all, people are worse overall with these interleaved harmonic tones with no delay. However, there was no significant difference when we introduced a delay here. So overall, harmonic sounds are better remembered, even though the spectrum seems to be used to hear back-to-back pitch changes. So this to me raised a question, do listeners actually switch between different pitch representations depending on the context? So this is pretty good circumstantial evidence that there might be a switch happening, but in order to confirm this, we leveraged this memory effect plus an individual differences approach. So we measured pitch discrimination thresholds, both with and without delay, in many people. The logic is that performance on tasks that rely on the same underlying representation should correlate across participants. So to just briefly go through this design, we tested people with inharmonic tones, harmonic tones, and these interleaved harmonic tones, either with and without a delay. We measured pitch discrimination thresholds, and I'll be showing you the correlation between those thresholds for different conditions across a delay. So let's go through a possibility. So one prediction, for example, is between the correlation between the two harmonic conditions. One possibility is that, well, we know that people must use a representation of the F0 in this harmonic interleaved condition. It's also possible that when people have access to the F0, they use it. So they might also use it in this harmonic condition, the standard harmonic condition. And if that's an approach that every participant in our experiment, or most participants in our experiment, take, then there should be a correlation between the performance on those two tasks. So again, performance on tasks that rely on the same underlying representations should correlate. So we'd see something like this. But that is not what we found. Instead, we found a strong correlation between our harmonic and inharmonic conditions, the two conditions where listeners can rely on the spectrum, without a delay, and that decreased with a delay, and then the opposite pattern for our two harmonic conditions. So the results actually suggest that listeners switch from one pitch code to another when remembering a sound, and this was more concrete evidence that there are, in fact, two different pitch representations. Listeners do not appear to have any awareness of, or any consciousness awareness of this switch. So all these experiments were run online, but the benefit of online data is that we can replicate these effects. So if you don't believe this first interaction, we replicated it in an additional 197 participants and found the same result. Okay, so hopefully what I've shown you so far is evidence for two different pitch representations. It seems like memory for pitch requires representations of the fundamental frequency. However, real-time pitch perception just requires representations of the spectrum. So this basic finding has led to several open questions that I'm going to tell you about for the rest of the talk today. Questions like, in what context do we use each pitch representation? Are these pitch representations experience dependent? Do we need to learn these multiple representations? And then how are these multiple representations implemented in the brain? There are many more questions, but I'll just be focusing on these three today. So I'll start with this first one. In what context do we use each pitch representation? I'm going to somewhat give away the punchline on the next slide because answering this first question has been the focus of several years of my work and several publications. And we found that harmonic structure seems to be critical for remembering pitch, which I've shown you already, musical interval discrimination and out-of-key tone detection, for voice recognition. It turns out that absolute pitch is a critical aspect of voice recognition, for detecting and discriminating tones and melodies in noise. But it actually does not seem to be necessary for basic pitch discrimination, providing invariance to timbral differences like different instruments and different speakers, which was a bit of a surprise to us, and also speech prosody and lexical tone discrimination. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this one finding, about detecting and discriminating tones and melodies in noise. So when I first started looking at this, I was curious whether just harmonic structure in general could aid hearing in noise. It's a primary cue used to segregate concurrent harmonic sources, the classic cocktail party problem. But it was unclear whether it would help hearing in noise. So for example, my favorite exemplar of this is, would the harmonic structure of a poor reporter's voice help you hear them through a hurricane? So to test this, I again leveraged this basic discrimination task. So again, I'll have thresholds, percent on threshold on the y-axis here, but all I did was I added background noise. And so from the left to the right on the x-axis, on the left is a lot of noise, on the right is no noise at all. And so these are the results for harmonic tones. And so with harmonic tones, we found that performance improved as SNR increased, as we might expect, but there was a pretty wide range of SNRs, noise SNRs, over which pitch discrimination is robust to this type of noise. But what happens when we test inharmonic tones? So here we found quite a striking difference. Again, we replicated this key effect that harmonic tones and inharmonic tones have comparable thresholds without noise, but even as we started to add sort of moderate levels of noise, discrimination thresholds for inharmonic tones rapidly rose. So harmonic tones are much easier to discriminate in noise than inharmonic tones. To put this in a physical context, if you can discriminate harmonic tones from about 10 meters away, you need to move 4 meters closer to be able to do the same discrimination with comparable inharmonic tones. So harmonic sounds are consistently easier to discriminate in noise, and it seems like representations of F0-based pitch may be actually more robust to noise than those based on spectral features. So I'll add that we've done some modeling, and we can't explain this result using basic features of these sounds like power or amplitude fluctuations. It does seem like the representation of F0-based pitch is simply more robust to those based on spectral features. Okay, so to answer this question, in what context do we use pitch representation? The two I've told you about today are representations of F0s, are critical for memory, and appear to be more robust to noise. So I brought up this noise result in particular because it has been a very useful lever to get at my next two questions. So I've actually used this effect of harmonic versus inharmonic discrimination in noise to examine pitch representations cross-culturally and then neurally. So I'll move on to the cross-cultural experiments. So a large arm of my work is cross-cultural research. I'm really fascinated by how life experience changes auditory perception. And for the better half of the last decade, I've been studying the Chimane, who are an indigenous population of hunter-agriculturalists living in the Bolivian Amazon. And I know you're going to hear a little bit more about this from Nori Jacoby in about an hour. So Chimane villages are located along a river in the Bolivian rainforest called the Maniqui River. This is an aerial view of one of the villages. They're very hard to access. If it has rained, your truck will get stuck. You can only get into the region when it's been dry. So suffice to say, the Chimane are quite isolated. They do have their own musical culture. Something that is striking about their musical culture, though not unique in the world, is that they do not appear to have group musical performance, as far as we can tell. So one example I like to give of this is this couple told us that they loved singing and playing duets together. We asked if we could take a photo and film them. And so what would happen is she would sing, which she's doing here, and then he would play the recorder, and then she would sing, and he would play the recorder. But they never did it at the same time. And that seems to be pretty indicative of their general way of performing music. So my colleague, Nori Jacoby, again, who will be speaking later, will be, in 2019, I was involved in a study that he led on pitch and singing. And the study found that pitch-related behavior varies in some respects between the USA and Chimane populations. So US musicians and non-musicians tend to match the pitch and the chroma when singing back melodies, whereas Chimane do not. So just to explain this a bit more, in Western classical music, our scale is built around 12 repeating notes labeled from A to G. And if I play a C, for example, that's very high above your singing range, most of you in this room, I assume, would try to sing back something close to a C in your singing range. Or if you heard a C in your singing range, you would try to sing back that exact pitch. However, that is not the approach that Chimane take to this task. So we can plot these results by showing a histogram, or a probability, of whether you're singing back the sort of exact pitch or chroma of the tone that you heard. And we see that's a very strong tendency for US musicians, weaker for US non-musicians, and non-significant for Chimane. So I wanted to build on this result and my work looking at multiple pitch representations to sort of uncover what pitch representations the Chimane might have. So in this experiment design, on each trial, participants would hear two complex tones in a continuous background noise and sing them back. We presented tones in multiple singing ranges. And there were 4 conditions: harmonic tones, inharmonic tones, with a low SNR and a high SNR. So we can analyze both the direction accuracy, or sort of the direction accuracy, and the pitch and chroma matching from the same sung response. So we actually collected this data over the past year and this past summer. There are 2 alternative hypotheses here. So pitch and chroma matching might be byproducts of sensitivity to F0. So since the Chimane do not appear to have pitch and chroma matching, they should also maybe not be better at discriminating harmonic versus inharmonic tones and noise. Maybe they won't show a sensitivity to this harmonic structure. Alternatively, sensitivity to F0 may be necessary, but not sufficient for pitch and chroma matching. The Chimane might exhibit sensitivity to harmonic structure measured by better discrimination of harmonic versus inharmonic tones and noise, despite limited or no measurable pitch and chroma matching. So I'll show you the results on these 2 axes. So on the left, we'll have direction accuracy for USA non-musicians. On the right, for Chimane, we tested individuals with half a semitone up to 4 semitones. And again, the 4 conditions are harmonic with a high signal-to-noise ratio, so this should be very easy. Inharmonic with a high signal-to-noise ratio. If it goes like our previous experiments, it should be comparable to that harmonic with a high SNR performance. And then these 2 low SNR conditions where we expect that there might be some impairment with the inharmonic tones. And we found that pretty clearly in USA non-musicians. So for high signal-to-noise ratios, harmonic and inharmonic direction accuracy was comparable, not significantly different. But for low SNRs, direction accuracy is significantly worse for inharmonic tones compared to harmonic tones. And we actually saw the same exact pattern in the Chimane. So the harmonic advantage for discrimination is present cross-culturally. Oh, sorry, that disappeared. And we didn't actually find any significant interaction between group and the effect of harmonicity. So this effect was the same across cultures. And we took these same responses, the same sung responses, and we replicated the previous pitch and chroma effects. So we do see these peaks in the pitch matching and chroma matching for our US non-musicians, but no significant, one tiny little significant peak in one of the harmonic conditions for the Chimane, and otherwise all the rest were non-significant. So we did see significant differences overall between the pitch and chroma matching between groups. So the second alternative hypothesis seems to be better supported here. Sensitivity to F0 appears to be necessary, but not sufficient to produce pitch and chroma matching. So our Chimane population, they do exhibit sensitivity to harmonic structure, measured by the fact that they do have better discrimination for harmonic tones versus inharmonic tones and noise, despite limited pitch and chroma matching. So to conclude this section, this use of multiple cues to discriminate pitch changes does appear to be shared across cultures. But this shared sensitivity to harmonic structure, or F0, is not sufficient to produce pitch and chroma matching, the incidence of which does vary. Okay, so are these pitch representations experience dependent? Well, to concretely answer this, there would be more work to do, but the initial indication from two cultures that have very different pitch-related behavior suggests that people across cultures do have both of these pitch systems. So this brings me to my final question. How are these multiple representations implemented in the brain? So again, I turn to this distinction between harmonic and inharmonic performance with and without noise in order to investigate the neural responses to these types of inharmonic tones. So participants in this experiment heard melodies made up of many different types of tones, including harmonic tones, inharmonic tones, harmonic and inharmonic tones embedded in noise, and also spectrally matched noise. We identified pitch-sensitive voxels using contrast between conditions, and then in independent data measured the response of those voxels to our different conditions. So I'm going to be showing you the results from our sort of classic pitch-sensitive voxels identified via the contrast of harmonic over spectrally matched noise. Sort of the initial most surprising finding for us is that these pitch-sensitive voxels appear to respond equally well, so our percent signal change, equally well to both harmonic and inharmonic tones when presented in quiet. So it just suggests that tracking the spectrum might be a basic aspect of pitch perception for real-world sounds. However, these pitch-sensitive voxels do respond more to harmonic versus inharmonic tones when we embed them in noise. You might be wondering, well, the pitch discrimination is worse for these inharmonic tones and noise. Maybe that can drive this effect. So the key thing here is we did not add actually that much noise to these tones, and we tested the melody discrimination performance for these harmonic and inharmonic stimuli that we used in the scanner, and we actually found comparable discrimination thresholds here. So these results are consistent with the idea that pitch perception often relies on individual frequencies in quiet, but then harmonic structure in F0 in noise. So we found overall that pitch regions of auditory cortex do respond similarly to harmonic and inharmonic stimuli, but there does appear to be some evidence for selectivity for harmonic sounds when listening in noise, but this does appear to be co-located with these non-harmonic selective responses. Okay, so I'll briefly summarize. I've hopefully convinced you that we have evidence for two different pitch representations, and there might be more. Memory for pitch in particular requires representations of F0, and representations of F0 seem to be more robust to noise. But real-time pitch perception relies on representations of the spectrum. The use of these multiple cues to discriminate pitch changes is shared across cultures despite other differences in pitch-related behavior. And pitch regions of auditory cortex do seem to respond similarly to harmonic and inharmonic stimuli, though there might be some selectivity for harmonic stimuli that is co-located with those responses. All in all, I hope I've just convinced you that pitch representations are richer, more diverse, maybe more interesting than previously thought. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. I'd like to thank the many collaborators on this project who have helped every step of the way, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Malinda. Fantastic overview of the work.
Thank you.
Really nice. Questions? We're done throwing?
Thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So this might sound a little bit basic, but when I think about the inharmonics that you're presenting here, I am assuming it may be perceived as chords or simultaneous intervals instead of just one tune. Have you considered that, or it's just a comment or thought about this?
Yes, I mean, that is a concern because you do all of a sudden have multiple frequencies, which would sort of indicate a chord. We have also, I think that the fact that we get the individual differences response, where the thresholds that we measure for the harmonic tones and the inharmonic tones are so strongly correlated across populations, does suggest that people are using the same underlying approach to compute those pitch changes, which I would not expect if you were processing them simply as chords or something in a different category than pitch. It does suggest that we actually are using the same underlying computation for those two types of sounds.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask whether you tested the situation in which the spectrum and the F0 are in conflict. So for example, a missing fundamental tone where the harmonics increase, but they are of a fundamental frequency that are decreasing.
Yes, I have tested that. I have an entire paper in 2023 about that exact topic. I think it's fascinating. And basically, when you do have that conflict, if the conflict is big enough, if none of the harmonics overlap, of course, performance with the inharmonic stimuli is not possible. You basically just have to follow the spectrum. However, when we make sounds like instruments or speech inharmonic, it does not influence discrimination thresholds.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I'm just wondering the specifics of the inharmonic stimuli, because there are many, vibrating objects that create inharmonic outputs, but some of them have several kind of perceivable F0s, which are kind of missing fundamentals, right? Like bells, for instance. You often have 2 or 3 separate tones. It's a little related to the other question. So I'm wondering if your inharmonic stimuli, if there were harmonic relationships between some of those partials that could create, like an ambiguous stimulus with more than one missing fundamental.
Absolutely, that's an excellent question. So when we first designed these inharmonic tones, we did try to maximize the amount of inharmonicity. So they can be jittered by up to 50% of the nominal F0, with the only caveat that they couldn't come within 30 hertz of one another, the adjacent harmonics, to avoid really salient beating. But as you as you point out, you could just by chance get an inharmonic tone that is actually quasi-harmonic. So to avoid this, for many of our experiments, we would actually generate about 100,000 random inharmonic patterns, and then find the, say, 20 that minimize the autocorrelation of the tones in order to find the most inharmonic stimuli that we could. And then we would test with only those. So that was one of the ways that we tried to get around it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm over here.
Hi.
So the brain data that you showed was really cool,
Thanks.
but I'm a little confused by it because I guess noise causes the brain area to respond less than inharmonic tones. I'm wondering about that continuum in between the two that's causing it to, like, what would cause it to not respond? What's the aspect of the sounds that would?
I think that's a great question. I think I need to do some more work here. My initial hypothesis is that these sort of classic pitch areas are responding best to this sort of spectral shift. And they just respond a lot less when they don't have that spectral shift present, which is what's happening in this case, and also somewhat in the harmonic case, where you embed the sounds in noise, and then you have to, in the harmonic case, only rely on F0, and in the inharmonic case, you don't have an F0 to rely on, and you can't hear out those individual harmonics. So to me, that somewhat explains the gradient, is that if these pitch-sensitive voxels respond best to these types of stimuli, then these two just don't have as much of that type of information in them, if that makes sense.
Sort of. Is there a change? Well, I didn't ask it super well. Is there a change to sound quality that could cause an effect?
Anecdotally, yes, I would say that these harmonic tones and noise just pop out and are very apparent in a way that inharmonic tones aren't. But again, we did try to test at very low levels of noise where that's not as salient as when we test in the much higher levels of noise.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.